When DayZ hit the games industry in 2012, it broke every rule written before it. From its cutthroat principle of permadeath, relentless design and technical marvel, the fact that you could run around in one of the biggest worlds in gaming together with 99 other players left a billion-dollar industry in the dust. Not only technical, but DayZ had the goal of portraying an open-world zombie apocalypse in video game form. That's like an art student setting out to film an unfilmable literary classic. It had Arma 2, a stagnant game now selling millions of copies on Steam. And as some put it, exposed one of the best secrets in gaming. Graphics have undoubtedly progressed since then, but in terms of scope, world and player count, no game developer has dared to challenge it, even now more than a decade later. The number one complaint against DayZ when it released in its mod form wasn't the tedious installation process or the clunky controls, it was the raging hacking epidemic. Which was its greatest strength and most severe detriment. To understand why, we need to peel back the layer that is DayZ and peek inside of Arma 2, the engine that's running it all. By definition, Arma 2 is a military simulator, and during development Bohemia knew full well the limitations and constraints they had to live with in order to deliver that experience. It manifested in one core belief: trust the client. While incredibly performant, it made hacking nearly as easy as flipping a switch. The secret weapon afforded to Arma and by connection DayZ stemmed from its roots as a simulator. Arma was built with the premise of constant data flow. More than a game server, it was a synchronization engine. Therefore, when Dean Hall, the creator of DayZ, came out the woodworks with DayZ, pushing 100 players was never the challenge. The challenge was balancing everything else we know about DayZ on top of that, like a Jenga tower, but the two last pieces, zombies and loot, happened to be as bulky as a couple of 2x4s. The silver bullet chambered in that secret weapon was Clientside AI, aimed at the difficult task of zombies. NPCs, even as dull as zombies, rely on decision-making, raycasting, and most demanding, pathfinding. In other games, having just a few extra on screen can grind your CPU to a halt. But distributing that workload with Client AI allowed Dean to task players' computers to spawn zombies and let their PC run its AI, its simulation, its animation, completely separate from the server. Freeing up resources for the server to do one thing and one thing only: synchronize. However, even Arma's AI is notoriously CPU intensive, so to prevent hogging all the processing power of your PC and killing frame rates, Dean created zombies from scratch. Designing them as agents as opposed to traditional units, making them brainless, which is oddly fitting for DayZ. Not only fitting, they were incredibly more performant compared to the unit counterpart. Players were now able to run up to 40 zombies all on their own accord. With a few players in the same area, you are now potentially facing an entire zombie horde. As for me, I'm trying to face 1,000 subs. I got DayZ content lined up for the remainder of the year. Consider subscribing not to miss out. Thank you. The last hurdle pushing DayZ out the door was loot spawns. Using 2012's hardware, how could you fill a 225 square kilometer map with food, drinks, and military loot? Well, you couldn't, but Dean had an idea. You don't need to fill the map with loot, you only need to fill the building you're right next to. Think of each building as its own entity, a very simple AI that would scan its vicinity for players and only populates its shelves, tables, and floors with loot if one gets close enough. Then, like clockwork, aggressively despawn the loot when no player is around to notice. Each building had its own configuration and probabilities as to what to spawn and how often. That variety and randomness helped hide the fact that loot was nothing more than an illusion. Zombies and loot in isolation is nothing new. What brought it over the top was scale. Coming from Arma, that large scale wasn't a design choice, it was a requirement. Simulating a battlefield in all-out war with tanks, helicopters, jets, and infantry demands scale, from microscopic details on your gun to kilometers of open airspace for supersonic jets. On a technical level, that scale boils down to one thing: precision, specifically floating point precision. In any game or game engine, if you build a large enough world and move far away from its origin, kilometers away, you'll find that the numbers starts to jitter about. Matter of fact, not only the numbers, but the entire world starts to. The numbers just gets too large for your computer to handle, and to convey that scale without interruption, the DayZ engine doesn't move the player around the world moves around the player. It sounds trippy, no matter how far you run, you're technically always at 000. Instead of moving the world when needed or upsizing memory when running out, Bohemia took a hard stance in favor of endless scale, and it paid off. Then there's the part about rendering the millions of objects in DayZ. There are more than 2 million, or rather the part about not doing so. Frost and culling is so ubiquitous within game engines, including DayZ's, that I almost don't need to mention it. Essentially anything outside the player's view, don't render it. That technique did work until DayZ faced Chernogorsk. Well, not just Cherno, but cities of that size. In Arma, towns and cities were mere backdrops. You weren't supposed to pay too much attention to them as they were nothing more than cover. They had no other gameplay purpose. Arma was therefore more concerned with open fields and cover, not detailed buildings and interiors. It was precisely that which lit graphics cards on fire, because pointed in one direction, even looking straight into a brick wall, your game would render that brick wall, every building behind it, every interior and every room in those interiors. With 060 and DayZ's new renderer, they perfected something called geometric occluders. It's really simple. It's about carefully and manually wrapping buildings in simple geometric shapes like cubes that tells your PC, if you see this, don't render anything behind it. Doubling or even tripling frame rates as the monumental task of rendering the entirety of a city was reduced down to render what's inside these boxes, don't bother with anything else. While other games have had big open worlds with good frame rates, credit where credit is due, no other games have had the nuts to open up every single interior. Without fail, the argument against it is always, why would I need to enter every single interior? The answer is scale, one aspect DayZ has always nailed. For every interior, they had manually wrapped every single piece of furniture and loot spawn in cubes. Think of them as black boxes. You don't need to know what's inside until you're right in front of them. Once you're actually close enough, data loads and all furniture and that M4 on the ground is finally rendered. A city like Cherno is filled with these black boxes. Loading them a few at a time is key. Loading them all at once and you're counting your frame rate on one hand. Now, as it relates to graphics, interiors are notoriously demanding. Not so much by graphical fidelity, but by materials. A room has floorboards, wallpapers, curtains, window frames. These naturally have different physical properties. They react to light differently. But swapping materials done on the GPU is expensive. DayZ therefore uses one material for an entire interior. In graphics, that's a no-go, which is exactly why they look a bit flat. If you ask me, that's a small price to pay to be able to enter every single interior. An arguably higher price to pay came in the shape of LOD pop-ins, and the community has been, let's say, vocal about it. What made cities like Cherno with hundreds of buildings, trees in the distance and a vast terrain beyond it even possible wasn't as much of clever engineering as it was sacrifice. Games only need to reveal as much detail as the player reasonably can see, and that's configured with something called level of detail. At a distance, buildings degrade gracefully, going from fully detailed to cube-like blobs, trees go from 3D models to flat billboards. It's at this point you'll notice the infamous LOD pop-in. It's jarring, and with a ton of flack from players, the devs plan to tackle that behemoth of an issue with 0630 by not addressing LODs, but by removing the ability for players to zoom in, making the switch less noticeable. Well, that didn't go over well and they backtracked. Okay, so that's one piece of the puzzle solved, showing buildings, trees and objects up close and kilometers away. The last piece, actually lighting them, is what has brought traditional game engines to their knees. Games usually cheat in this regard. They have so-called baked lighting, meaning lighting is calculated before you even boot up the game. It's like you, the player, are walking around a snapshot of the world, like a very detailed photograph of a specific point in time on that specific map. But DayZ has two things going for it. It has a huge map, and that map constantly changes with the day and night cycle. Since the time of day changes, you cannot pre-bake lighting, and even if you could, storing that data from every nook and cranny in Chernards would have you not looking at gigabytes, you'd be looking at terabytes. Well, Bohemia knew this from the get-go and tailored the DayZ engine to work around these two must-haves. The solution is spelled out global illumination, or rather, the lack of it. Looking at an interior in DayZ, you cannot argue that it doesn't look flat. You maybe can't put your finger on exactly why, but how about now? It boils down to lighting, and lighting should bounce around a room, but it doesn't. DayZ cheats by using a global light, like a huge light bulb in the sky that lights up the brightest roof and the darkest corner of the building with the same intensity. It's not a design choice, it's a survival trick. A survival trick sprinkled in with workarounds, since there are still pitch black areas that shouldn't be possible, but the game quietly cranks down the intensity of that light bulb when you enter those areas, and a prime example of that being the Livonia bunker. DayZ was ahead of its time and still kind of is. It made me question, why didn't DayZ exist before it did? It was clearly a $1 million idea, but it wasn't exactly a new idea. Not now, not 15 years ago. Remember, this was at a time when zombies were everywhere. The Walking Dead was prestige TV, Zombieland was in cinemas, and COD Zombies was in its heyday. Was it that no one thought of it or simply couldn't get it done? Let me spoil the answer and say the industry definitely thought of it, and the proof is in Class 4, a zombie survival MMO that got the ball rolling in 2009, and that's 3 years before DayZ. Studio Undead Labs laid out the fundamentals of DayZ years before but couldn't find a publisher willing to gamble on an unproven concept that came with the bill of an MMO. They eventually partnered with Microsoft in 2011 and brought out Class 3, renamed State of Decay, a stripped-down version of what they initially had promised. Class 4, with its 1,000-player servers and huge world, was later abandoned, citing tech limitations. The difference is, DayZ didn't set out to solve those tech limitations, they had been solved years before. All they had to do was to instigate the marriage between the zombie apocalypse concept with a simulator that afforded him scale, immersion, and multiplayer. And I can't blame anyone for not beating him to the punch. As some have said, Arma was one of gaming's best kept secrets. Those secrets, once exposed, laid the groundwork for an entire genre of battle royale games at a scale we've never seen before. DayZ has happened to do it a decade before.